So in the beginning, the first thing you kind of learn is you learn tools. You learn the jab, you learn the kick, you learn takedown, you learn, a choke, you learn an arm bar, you learn a knee to the body. Those things are simply tools. They're not in and of themselves tactics just yet. Then you go through a phase after you work your tools, you start to develop technique. So when you develop technique, and most people will mistake tools for technique because they'll say it all the time. They'll say, um, "Show me this technique," and people will say, "Okay, here's my jab," and that's not exactly technique. It's a tool, but it's not exactly technique. When you develop your tools, let's start with tools, tool development. Let's look at. We just gave an example of the jab, the cross, the hook, the choke, the elbow, the takedown. Then you have to consider the range you're in when developing tools. Every tool is dictated by a particular range. You have to have an understanding of that particular range. That doesn't mean that you can't kick in punch range, but you want to start simple. Start with the simplest range for the simplest kicks. Start with the simplest range for the simplest punches, for the elbows, for the knees, for the choke. All right? Yes, you can do standing chokes, but the range is slightly different than if you were on the ground. Also, we want to pay attention to distance. Why do we want to pay attention to distance? Isn't distance and range the same thing? Those are two words that people kind of play with for decades. They'll say, "Oh, distance. We're just talking about long distance, middle distance, short distance," and they'll, incorporate the word range into it. Ranges, I'm specifically talking about where the specific tool fits in, but in terms of distance, I'm talking about you personal. Your distance changes inside of each range based on your personal attributes. If you're tall, if you're short, if you're theoretically slow or fast, things change. And so we want to look at those things. We want to look at these when we're developing tools. We want to look at you specifically going through these phases, because just because we're going to teach you the jab, it may not be used the same way that Muhammad Ali would use his jab, and that's when we start getting into tactics. But next, we want to move to technique. We want to develop the technique. So how do we develop your technique? Well, first you have to kind of learn something, and so you go through a pattern of learning sequential movements. You push off your back foot, you step forward on the front. Sometimes you pop your hips, sometimes you don't. What you start to learn is there's different variations of every tool, and these variations help me as a performance strategist figure out which one works best for you inside of what range. Instead of me just showing you pretty much generic stuff that you can just about find anywhere. Go through a pattern, then you learn your structure. For those who've trained with me, structure is simple. 5 elements. Anytime your structure is starting to break down, your opponent is starting to break you down. So your structure is very simple. You want to understand your posture, your position, your timing, your distance, and your balance at all times. At all times. Because we're in the technique phase, and those are the 5 common elements of all techniques, regardless of the art or where they come from.